In this tutorial, we're going to start actually editing photos and making them look better in Photoshop. The first type of photo we're going to edit in this section is a raw image. We talked about raw images before. I can't remember exactly what lesson it was, but basically raw images are uncompressed files that professional cameras like DSLR and mirrorless cameras can shoot. Cameras like point and shoot cameras or your smartphones actually compress images after you shoot them so that they are actually smaller file sizes. And that doesn't give you as much room to edit. Meaning, if your photo is very, very bright, almost overexposed, sometimes you can't make it perfectly exposed. On the other hand, a raw image, if it's very, very bright or very, very dark, there's more room to edit. You can bring up dark parts of your image. You can darken lighter part of your images without it looking weird. In the folders, we have lots of raw images, but you can open up this exposure.nef file. Just double click that or right click and open in Photoshop. When you open a raw image, Camera Raw will pop open. Now I'm using the latest version of Photoshop Creative Cloud. Yours might look a little bit different than this, but whether you're using an older version or not, the process of editing a raw image is very similar. Up here on the top left are a bunch of tools. We're going to cover many of these throughout this lesson and future lessons, but first we're going to just dive right into editing your photo because that's what you want to do and that's how I want this class to be. I do want to warn you that this lesson will be a little bit longer than some of the other ones because there is just so much that we have to cover. And even if I don't cover everything in too much detail, I'm going to be covering other specific aspects of Camera Raw in more project-based lessons in the future. Or if there's anything that you want me to cover more and I don't, just let me know and I'll be happy to further explain or create another lesson on it. So on the right, you have your different editing tabs. So you can click these different buttons right here, and these go to different editing options. If you've edited with Adobe Lightroom before, these editing tools will be very familiar to you, and these are the same kind of editing options you see in a lot of photo editors. But starting from the first tab of Basic and going top to bottom, we have our white balance. Right now, the white balance is set as shot. That's how I shot the photo. If I want to change the white balance, I can use one of these drop-down menus. And this photo is actually, the white balance is really good, but if it was off and you knew the day was cloudy or we were inside, we were using a flash, you can just choose one of these presets and it should fix the actual white balance of your film. So if I choose daylight, which this was, it changes it a little bit and it actually makes it a little bit blue. And so I don't like that. Sometimes it doesn't work perfectly. If I choose auto, it makes it a little bit too warm. If I choose cloudy, it'll make it a little bit more blue from there, and I actually like that. I'm just going to leave it as shot. The other way to edit white balance is with these sliders. So we can make the temperature of a photo more cool by sliding to the left or more warm by sliding to the right. This is a wedding photo that we shot of my wife and I. My photographer Will shot it, and it was a cool photo. I like the composition because it's a little bit different. It's of our chest, and you see our boutonniere and our flower bouquet and just the details. It's not about us, it's not about our faces, it's about the details. So if we want to add a little bit of style to this, maybe we do want to brighten it up a little bit. The next slider is tint. Sometimes your images will look a little bit greenish or pinkish or magenta. Really, that's what this color is. And you might have to use this to fix that. One other way to get perfect white balance is with this white balance tool up here. If we select this white balance eyedropper, then come to our page, you want to find something in your image that is white or a neutral color. So like a gray or a white. If your image doesn't have a gray or white object in it, you're going to have to use the sliders or the drop-down menu over here. But there's lots of white in this image, specifically Isabel's dress, and I'll just click on there, and it barely did anything. But if you click there, you see that the temperature increases just a bit. And what that does with this tool, it automatically makes the image, the whites of this image, pure white, and then it balances the rest according to what is white in your image. Below white balance, we have our exposure sliders. So we have an overall exposure slider that increases or decreases the entire exposure of everything in this image. And as you can see, I can go down or up to make it really bright. If you want to reset any of these adjustments, just double click this little marker in the slider and it will go back to 0. You can also hover your mouse over the slider and press down on your keyboard, down and up, to move the slider up and down if you don't want to click and move the slider, or you can just click in here and type in a number. Now let's take a moment to talk more about exposure. You see up here, this is your histogram, and this histogram shows what parts of your image are bright and what parts of your image are dark. Over here on the right, these are the brights. On the left, those are your darks. If I drop the exposure, you see this histogram change, and most of these colors go over to the dark parts. We want our image to have exposure from basically the bottom to the top. That's typically what a good photo looks like, especially when you have actual dark parts of your photo. If you're taking a picture of the sky or of a white sandy beach, you're not going to have dark parts of your image. But if you have a photo like this where there are some darks in the flowers, darks on my suit, and then some brights of the dress or the highlights in the hair, you should have a histogram that looks something like this, where it goes from the bottom to the top. If we click on these icons right here in the top left or top right, this will give us an idea for where the highlights or the overexposed parts of our images are. So you can see if I darken this, those red parts go away. But if I put this back here, red parts start to appear. If I go crazy with it, you get lots of red parts. If I turn that off, then you don't see them. If you turn it on, you see the red parts. And that is telling us that these parts are overexposed. We don't want overexposure, especially on our main subjects. Sometimes when you're taking a photo with a sun in it, or where there's a really bright reflection, you will have some overexposed part of your images. But if that's happening on your subject's face or on their shirt, that's not good. And then the same thing goes for the darks. If we select the darks and we go down, this photo isn't very dark, but you can start to see a little bit of blue dots right here appear. So those blue dots are showing us where things are underexposed. And really what this means, whether it's underexposed or overexposed, it's saying that there's literally no information there. It's just too dark or too bright. There's no actual color, there's no detail, there's no definition. This is just a black hole or a white hole of nothingness. And we don't want that. We want it to be balanced. So that's just a good thing to know about how to use the histogram. So with this photo, it is a little bit overexposed, and maybe that's a style that you kind of like for these wedding photos. I see a lot of people doing that. But to expose it really normally, I'm just going to drop the overall exposure just down to about -1. Contrast is the next slider. And what contrast does is it makes the darks darker and the brights brighter. So if I slide to the right, that's what it's doing. It's making the darks darker, the brights brighter. You can see that it spreads out this histogram as I slide to the right. If I slide to the left, it's doing the opposite. It's making the darks actually brighter and the brights darker. It makes the image look very flat, neutral. The other thing that contrast does is with more contrast, the image becomes more saturated. With less contrast, it becomes a little less saturated. So that's just something to note. When you add contrast, know that you're actually adding saturation too. So for this image, I'm just going to add a little bit of contrast. We can also add contrast with these other sliders and adjust things in our image with these next 4 sliders. The highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks sliders just adjust the parts of the image that are highlights. So if I adjust this slider, it's just adjusting the highlights. You can see on the shoulders and in my shirt right here, that's really what it's adjusting. And this is a good slider to use because you see right here we have our highlights that are overexposed. We can drop down those highlights quite a bit so that really there's nothing overexposed in this image. And that's the power of shooting in RAW. If we shot this as a JPEG image or a compressed image on our iPhone, you wouldn't be able to bring down those highlights and make them not overexposed anymore. With the shadows, it's the same thing. We can adjust the shadows. Sometimes I typically like to just bring down the highlights and bring up the shadows a bit, which makes the details of the photo more apparent. You can see in the darks a little bit. To add a little bit more contrast to the really dark and really white parts of the photo, you can use these sliders. So as I drop down the blacks and increase the whites, I might get a little bit of that overexposure again. So maybe I don't want to do that with the highlights. But dropping down the blacks can add a little bit of contrast. It makes the darks darker. And when it does that, it makes the overall image look a little bit too dark for me. So I'm just going to go up to my exposure using my up key on my keyboard. I'm just going to bring this up to negative 0.50. That looks a lot better to me. So those are the different exposure sliders and contrast sliders. The next is clarity. What clarity does is it makes the edges of things in your photo more defined and more sharp, and it adds contrast to the edges. If you go to the left, it makes things blurry. You can see it really dramatically when you go all the way to the left. I don't like adding clarity to a lot of images. I use clarity when I'm shooting landscape photos, or if you want that HDR looking effect, when you don't shoot an actual HDR photo, you can add clarity to make it look with like that HDR effect, which is high dynamic range, where everything is the right exposure. So for this, I'm just gonna add a little bit of clarity just to make things a little bit sharper. And then last, we have vibrance and saturation. Vibrance and saturation are similar. They're like cousins. Saturation, first off, adds more color and makes colors throughout the entire photo brighter. But you can see this does not look good. If I slide all the way to the right, our skin becomes orange. The colors of the plants don't look good. Not good at all. To make your image black and white quickly, you can just drop all the saturation to negative 100. Vibrance, on the other hand, is more of a smart saturation. When you increase vibrance, it increases the saturation of all colors except for more of the skin tone colors, so the browns and the yellows and the reds. It doesn't increase the saturation of those colors as much, which is great for pictures like this where we just want to increase the saturation of the greens and in the bow tie and in the plants, but not of our skin itself. You can see if I decrease the vibrance, it decreases a lot of the colors except for these greens, but by increasing, it increases the saturation of just the greens and not the rest of these colors. So vibrance is a good tool that I like to use a lot to make photos pop a little bit more. Instead of doing this all custom yourself, you can just click this auto button, and it does try to do things auto, and it does a pretty good job. When I choose the auto option, I think my shirt is a little bit too bright. I like dropping down the highlights and the whites to make sure that they're exposed properly. These are tools that you'll probably use for every photo that you open up in Photoshop and in the Camera Raw module. We're going to go over the rest of these tabs in the future lessons, but I want to end it here because this was a long lesson, and I want you to just go ahead and practice with this photo or practice with any photo that you have that's the RAW format. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.